Hello and welcome back to the Freight Flow Advisor Brief. This podcast is all about breaking down the stories that actually move freight markets, not just the headlines. Today we're going to talk about something big, no pun intended. The North American rail is a big chunk of global supply chains. BNSF's Barstow Intermodal Gateway project in California and the proposed Megamerger between Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern are both selling the same big idea. Let's put less trucks on the road and move more on trains. But the way that they're trying to get there could not be more different. You see, on one side, you've got BNSF spending billions on a new inland rail gateway at Barstow. On the other, UP and NS are asking regulators to approve the first coast-to-coast railroad in the United States. Now, if you're a shipper, a carrier, a forwarder, or even an investor, this isn't just rail gossip. This is network design in real time. So I want to start with the basics for anyone who's new to these stories. First, we're going to start with BNSF. In June of 2026, the Barstow City Council in California approved BNSF's Barstow Intermodal Gateway, titled BIG for short. You need to think of BIG as a huge inland port and rail campus. It's roughly 4,500 acres on the west side of Barstow. It's a planned $4 billion private investment. There'll be track, yards, and on-site warehouses all in one place. Right now, most import containers from Asia land at the ports of LA and Long Beach. Then they get hauled by trucks to warehouses across the Inland Empire. It's congested, it's expensive, and it's heavily reliant on drayage capacity. BNSF wants to flip that model on its end. The idea behind BIG is this. Container lands at either LA or Long Beach, and instead of going directly into a truck, it's going to move by rail through the Alameda corridor straight to Barstow. Once it's at Barstow, it's transloaded into a 53-foot domestic container. That domestic box moves east on BNSF's main line, the Southern Transcon. BNSF says it can cut 2 to 3 days out of the current transload process. And additionally, it can eliminate a big chunk of truck miles tied to local drayage. Their own projections about this are about 205 million truck miles removed in 2028. And they're going to grow that to 269 million in 2033 and 312 million by 2048. Now, when we look at the other story, in 2025, Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern announced a plan to merge, and they're creating what they're calling America's first transcontinental railroad, a single company with Western UP track and Eastern NS track all under one roof. Their pitch is different, but the headline, it sounds kind of familiar. They say the combined network will convert about 2.1 million truckloads a year from highway to rail. They claim that roughly 3.6 billion truck miles will be off the road. So on paper, both of these projects are trying to solve the same problem, in my opinion. Too many trucks doing long haul work that could be done more efficiently by trains. But here's the key. BNSF is trying to win by building a gateway. UP and NS are trying to win by reshaping the entire map. So I want to make this really clear for a new listener. If you've ever routed freight, you know there are two main points. The gateway, and that's getting boxes off the ship and into inland networks. Then there's the long haul. That's moving freight across country between major regions. BNSF's Barstow project is targeted almost entirely at that gateway. They're effectively saying, let's stop shuttling every import container by truck between the port and the Inland Empire warehouses. Let's push that movement onto rail inland and do the conversion work in one place. That's a very infrastructure heavy solution. It's earthworks, track miles, cranes, warehouses, and even yard equipment. Now, UP and NS are targeted at the long haul. They're saying, let's stop handing freight off between railroads in Chicago or other interchange points. Let's make one railroad responsible for a full west to east move so shippers can get a single line service with fewer handoffs and less delays. So if you're new and listening to this, picture it this way. The gateway model is BNSF's BIG. Ship lands at LA, Long Beach, container moves by rail directly inland, gets converted into domestic boxes at Barstow, and it heads east. The goal? Remove the short haul truck trips around the ports. Alternatively, you have the network model. UP and NS freight starts somewhere in the west. UP NS moves it across their combined track without handing it to another railroad. and it arrives at an eastern destination. Its goal is to remove the rail-to-rail handoff delays that cause missed connections and inconsistent service. It's the same rhetoric, though, less truck freight, but it's a different point of attack. And here's what makes this interesting and, frankly, such a hot topic. BNSF is not trying to match UP and NS with its own mega merger, although it could. It's trying to prove it can defend its position by literally pouring concrete and laying steel. Now, that was a lot, so we're going to take a break here and talk about Freight Flow Advisor. So let's talk about how you actually make sense of this in a day-to-day. Because freightfa.com is where you can go to truly strategize and think through this. Because if you're listening to this and thinking, okay, cool story, but I still have to move freight next week, this is where Freight FA starts to really matter. At the heart of Freight FA is the Freight Flow Advisor chat. You can drop in your lanes, models, and constraints, and it will act as your 24/7 freight analyst, giving you scenario-driven guidance instead of generic advice. If you want to understand how a project like Barstow or even a mega merger like UP-NS might change your routing or cost baseline, you can ask directly in the chat and get lane-specific analysis. Now listen, if you like Freight FA, we have structured our pricing extremely competitively. It's built for operators and decision makers who need signal, not noise. Our plans are very transparent, and they scale from a single user to a full procurement and network team. There's no gimmick AI tax on top, just pricing that lines up with the value of better routing and cost intelligence. And the benefits go beyond the chat. You can run cost comparisons across truck, intermodal, rail. You can test big what-if scenarios. You can align your routing decisions with your budget, service goals, and risk tolerance, instead of kind of guessing in the dark and doing the math behind the scenes. So head over to freightfa.com and check out the Freight Flow Advisor and start turning stories like this into actionable routing and pricing decisions. Now, as we pivot back to our original story, I want to zoom out from the rail logos and talk about why this story is bigger than just two companies. First, if you haven't been paying attention, infrastructure is becoming strategy, not just background. BNSF is pairing Barstow with $3.6 billion in capital planning for 2026, covering track, capacity, and projects like big. That's not just maintenance, that's a clear signal to shippers and investors. They're saying we're going to compete by upgrading the physical network and assets where it truly counts. They also went through California's SB 149 fast track process, making big one of the first transportation projects to get that certification. Anyone who's ever tried to build in California knows that's not a trivial thing. It's kind of a regulatory moat. On the other side, UP, NS, and the merger is testing how far regulators will let networks consolidate in the name of efficiency. The Surface Transportation Board has already pushed back on areas of completeness in their application. And there's an active opposition from shippers, labor, and competing railroads. So you've got BNSF really building concrete and track to cement its gateway, while you have UP and NS trying to redraw the map to cement a national advantage. For global supply chain leaders, this hits several pressure points. The first is port-centric risk. LA and Long Beach remain critical entry points for Asian imports. The more that inland movement is tied to one railroad's infrastructure, the more important it becomes to understand that railroads' service history, their capital planning, and their regulatory exposure. The second thing is intermodal competitiveness. Both plays are making rail more credible versus long-haul trucking, whether by speeding up gateways or eliminating interchanges. That matters for any shipper who's wondering if now is finally the time to shift more freight off the highway. Third, network planning and procurement. Because if big works, warehouse location decisions around Southern California may move further inland. If UP-NS works, routing decisions on east-west lanes may tilt towards single line rail. Either way you look at this, you can't just look at base rates anymore. You need to understand how infrastructure and mergers change total costs of service to include dray and dwell, as well as risk. This is where tools like Freight FA slot in, giving you a way to model those shifts before you commit to new contracts or redesign your network. Now, I want to be clear. There's a line that comes up a lot in rail conversations. When railroads compete, shippers win. So the UP-NS merger is being sold as a way to make rail more competitive with trucking. But there is a real risk that too much consolidation actually does the opposite. It reduces competitive tension, and it makes it harder for shippers to push back on price or service if things go sideways. I think BNSF sees that risk clearly. Their own communications around this merger are pretty blunt, arguing that UP already has a lot of power in certain corridors and that by adding NS, it could tilt the market even further. In fact, instead of threatening a countermerger with CSX or yelling from the sidelines, BNSF is doing something real tangible here. It's building a facility that will exist whether this merger goes through or not. And that, in my view, is the more interesting signal because it suggests a mindset shift. Don't just fight mergers in the hearing room, compete on the ground with infrastructure that makes your network harder to bypass. So if you're an executive listening to this, the takeaway is simple. Ask every carrier, not just railroads, what are you physically doing to make my freight move better in the next 3 to 5 years? Ask yourself, do my routing and sourcing strategies assume the network will stay static, or have I built flexibility for moves like Barstow and UPNS? I want to be clear here, though. There is a timing angle. BNSF needs big to move quickly. Every year of delay lowers the value of we're building while they're talking. UP and NS need to convince regulators that the merger won't just create a bigger version of today's problems. Both sides are saying they will pull trucks off the road. Over the next few years, the market will judge them on how many they actually remove and at what cost and service level. So I want to close with a quick watch list, something that you can use in your own updates and board decks. Here's 3 things to keep an eye on. First, the Barstow milestones. Will construction really start in 2026? And how quickly does BNSF stand up transload capacity? The second thing to watch is UPNS regulatory and customer signals. How does the STB ultimately rule? Do major shippers publicly support the merger as a net positive, or do they lean towards skepticism? We've seen healthy sides of both. The last thing you should look at is your own network behavior. Are you starting to test routing options that assume big exist or a merged UPNS? Are your tools and data strong enough to tell you when it's time to pivot lanes or rebalance your modal mix? If you're not modeling these changes yet, this is the moment to start because the message underneath all of this is clear. Freight is moving towards fewer trucks and more rail. But who controls that rail and which infrastructure gets built will determine how much you pay and how reliably your product moves. So that's it for today's episode. If you want to go deeper, make sure you head over to substack.com and search the Freight FA Brief. We placed an article on Substack on this very topic. It goes further in depth than we can go on this podcast. And if you're ready to turn stories like Barstow and the UPNS into real routing and pricing decisions, head over to freightfa.com. Try out the Freight Flow Advisor chat. You can plug in your lanes and test different scenarios. If you've enjoyed this show, make sure you share it with a colleague. You can follow us on social media at the Freight Flow Advisor. We're on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Lastly, if you want to watch us, you can head over to YouTube and search the Freight Flow Advisor. Until next time, this has been your Freight Flow Advisor Brief.